Chris was our speaker in March of last year. He's also a board member for CFI Long Island and the vice president of Suffolk County now, National Organization of Women, and a vegetarian, and somehow he manages to have a life in amongst all these different things, which is wonderful. And here we go. So I'd like to present Chris McDougal, and I will run and get the marker. Thank you, Bill.
Thank you. Amy said two key things there that I don't have. I'm stressed in my life. That's the parenting part, although I have a cat, and the moving part right now. So I think you're a little bit more busy than I am. Anyway, thanks for coming out tonight, and I appreciate your attention. I remember the last time I was here, we were talking about terrorism, and I primarily showed a video that night, and there were a couple of people who seemed a little more frustrated that I wasn't speaking more and saying what I thought about terrorism. And essentially at the end, someone directly asked me that question, and I remember saying something to the effect of, well, I kind of agree with what Noam Chomsky says about it. So I find his arguments persuasive, and added a little bit more to that. But tonight I'll be just giving you some elementary thoughts about religion and how it has changed over the past and what we can expect of it out of the future. So specifically what I want to do is talk about the relationship between religion and different kinds of societies. So I'll start by describing the different kinds of societies, the rate of social change in these societies and characteristics of these societies, because those link back to the type of religion you see correlated with each society type. I'll talk just for a moment about on a theoretical level how we can analyze religion using tools of sociology. I don't want to spend too much time on that, but I then want to address a couple of key questions that people in free thought circles think a lot about with religion. One of those being whether religion is going to go away as societies modernize, as they become more, as the populations of modern societies become more educated, as democracy it rises. Some of you know have already in the popular press gotten wind of what most sociologists think about that. It's a little counterintuitive. We'll spend some time on that. And then I want to go over a puzzling thing about the religious parts of the country. Is there really a Bible Belt? I mean, and intuitively I would say yes, and it seems like there is, but there's a really high-achieving professor of sociology, Rodney Stark, who is head of the religions section of the American Sociological Association for a while. He contends that there is no Bible Belt, but there is something that's the opposite of it, an unchurched belt. So I'll talk about why he would say that and why we might rethink a few assumptions about the South. So again, my name is Chris McDougal, and if you're hearing me for the first time, you may be recognizing an accent. That's a Southern accent. I grew up in Atlanta and lived in Birmingham, Alabama for 12 years and went to graduate school there, and I've lived here for 3 years, so don't let the accent throw you off. To begin with, I want to talk about these society types, and I'll be making a reference to a guy named Gerhard Linsky. Linsky is a very well-known macro sociologist. He's actually written a whole textbook in sociology looking at emphasizing technology and how broad-scale changes like globalization have occurred over time. If any of you, have studied anthropology and sociology, you might have seen references to his name, and you'll often see Linsky and Linsky with a citation, and the other Linsky was his wife, who was a noted poet. And she died, I think, back in the late 1990s, and so you originally saw decades ago, you saw Linsky being cited, Linsky in a year in textbooks and journal articles. Then there was Linsky and Linsky, so he gave his wife credit for helping him out in his research, and then she passed away and he went back to Linsky again. I thought that was sort of sad. But anyway, he's a noted authority on bringing together and synthesizing a wide body of research on societies and their characteristics, and religion is one of those. So I just want to make a reference to him, Gerhard Linsky. And the model of his, the theory is called sociocultural evolution. And what makes that his theory and his unique contribution is his emphasis on technology as a prime mover of what changes societies over time. So you have some societies that are very technologically primitive, some that are very technologically complex, with weaponry and devices that can do harm, as well as some good things like maybe air conditioning in the sweltering summers of the South in this country. So he emphasizes technology. That's part of still today a contemporary debate about what changes societies. Others emphasize different things. Some of the founding fathers of sociology emphasized, like for example, Karl Marx would put more emphasis on class conflict. He had to be reworked like any old thinker to modernize his views. Max Weber, another founding father of sociology, put more emphasis on ideas and certain beliefs. One of his greatest works was called The Protestant Ethic and the Spirit of Capitalism, finding a link between capitalism on a mass global scale and a particular Calvinistic Protestant belief, predestination. And he saw that those were inherently linked. So there are different emphases that are still part of the contemporary debate. Again, Linsky's emphasis is purely on technology. He thinks that's the most important thing. But we can set aside what is the prime mover of societies and just look at the description of these societies, which there's wide agreement on his model. It's very good. It's up to date. And he just came out with the most recent edition of his book. So again, you got several societies. I have a marker that writes. One is the hunter-gatherer, also known as foraging society. And I may just give up on this if I can't press a little harder. You all can't see that, right?
Not really. No.
Not really? Okay, I won't bother with it.
Maybe 30 years ago I could have. Not anymore.
Well, it's also a function of where you're sitting, too. Maybe if you were closer up here. Anyway, so you got hunter-gatherer societies. You also have horticultural or pastoral societies. Now, those are really two different types of societies, but they're often lumped together because they have something in common, that is, domesticating something. In the case of horticultural societies, domesticating plants. In the case of pastoral societies, domesticating animals. And they come about the same time out of the Fertile Crescent region of the Middle East. The technology spreads west and east around the world. And you sort of see one way to think of these societies, and the reason there are two different ones, is that the pastoral societies seem to have emerged in places where you could not grow crops. So we're talking about desert areas and mountainous regions. So it's sort of an alternative form to the default mode, which is the domestication of plants, cultivation of plants. Then after that, you see agrarian societies. That's large-scale agriculture using the technology of metallurgy attached to animals early on, humans sometimes in the case of slavery, and in modern times we would also include tractors and large-scale, powerful sources of energy. Then industrial societies after that, and then in the past few decades, post-industrial societies. So we can look back to a time frame for all of these societies. Hunter-gatherer societies were the dominant form all the way up until really 12,000 years ago. The horticultural and pastoral societies, you started seeing those emerge in various forms before that, but you don't really, I don't think most analysts would say you had them in their full form until about 12,000 years ago. And if you do the math on that, if you go back to the beginning of our genus, and we're talking there about 3 million years ago, our species, about 300,000 years ago, you do the math on that, that's over 99% of our evolutionary heritage. We were foraging for food as hunter-gatherers, and that explains a whole lot of things, from our tendency to gain weight when we're around abundance with little exercise required to get the nutrition, to the fight or flight reaction that you hear about when we're on the LIE and someone cuts us off and our body reacts as though a tiger is in the vicinity. But a lot of things are explained by that. But anyways, so you had that until 12,000 years ago, and then you start seeing both of these other types I mentioned, horticultural or pastoral. Then by 5,000 years ago, you have the agrarian societies. Roman Empire is a famous example. China was one. Egypt. You'll notice that a lot of these societies I'm naming, they all have some kind of great work associated with them. When we think about the wonders of the world, these are societies that often had extreme inequality. You would have a tiny category of elites, a monarch, a ruler of some kind, an emperor, a pharaoh, and they could wield great power over the masses of people, in part because the ideologies in these societies are very entrenched and strong. If we talk about feudalism in Europe, in those agrarian societies, the Pope and the kings sort of worked hand in hand in a way. In fact, they would literally have a ceremony where the Pope would bless a king, put a crown on the king's head or a queen's head perhaps, and then the king or queen would rule by divine right. And that kind of ideology would keep the masses in check and prevent a lot of what otherwise might have been revolts that would have occurred. And you think about how you can then build amazing things using that kind of oppression from the pyramids in Egypt, which were tombs. You know, there's a little dispute on this, but tombs for one person, the pharaoh. Just imagine what a badass you must be if you have that kind of power that you can wield over people to build that just for you, individual, again, to the Great Wall and other things around the world that are so awe-inspiring today. And then, again, by the mid-1700s in Europe, you have the Industrial Revolution, well, you know, known to most of you, I would imagine, talked about a lot in the mass media. Yes?
Can I do a question now? Or
Sure.
yes? Technology, does that include methods as well as means? It's not just hardware, it's not know-how.
Yeah, I had to think about that for a second. The operational definition I'm using when I say technology is a type of knowledge applied to the task of living in your surroundings. So that would be a method, I think. And that's a real broad use of it. Techno comes from Greek meaning to know, a type of applied knowledge. And then in post-industrial societies, I think most sociologists would pinpoint that to about 1973. We're talking about the United States and soon after other societies around the world, Japan, Western Europe. The reason 1973, so specifically, that's the year in which the total value, look at the gross domestic product we say now and use now, you put that on the goods and services that are produced, the value of services eclipsed that of actual manufactured goods in 1973. So we became one of these information-based economies in that year. So that's a good year to pinpoint that. And by that time, you start to see rising inequality again in the United States after several decades of decreasing inequality. So all these societies that I've mentioned a time frame to go with each one. We could also talk about the rate of productivity. There's a ratio that a well-known anthropologist calculated for each of these societies to show how much food or how much valued resources an average member of these societies gets for the energy they expend procuring food and other resources. And this anthropologist, Marvin Harris, really well known in anthropology circles, calculated a 1-to-3 ratio for hunter-gatherer societies. And that means that the way you interpret that is for every calorie that members of a typical hunter-gatherer society spend seeking food, they get 3 calories back in return. Calorie, of course, being a measure of heat expenditure. And that sounds like a lot, but that's an average figure. It goes up sometimes a little bit, it goes down a little bit if you're having like floods or a famine or a drought or something. And it dips down to 1 to 2, 1 to 1.5, you're on the brink of starving. And in fact, most hunter-gatherer societies throughout history have gone extinct, partly because they're small to begin with. So if a member of the society gets an infection, these societies are usually 50 to 100 people, really small. If someone gets an infection, it can spread and just wipe out the whole society. That's one reason. They're very fragile. And number two, they're barely getting enough food to eat to begin with. So they're working very hard and getting minimal nutrition in return. When you get to horticultural pastoral, that second type that I mentioned, the ratio he calculated is 1 to 15. So that is 5 times more productive. And that allows them to free up some of their labor so they don't all have to seek food all the time. They then are allowed to have at least semi-permanent settlements in the case of horticulture, where they can stay in a location for a while and slash and burn, and they eventually do have to move. Pastoral societies remain nomadic and keep moving. But they free people up to specialize in tasks, so you start getting full-time priests. Now you get people who might make shoes. In the earlier hunter-gatherer societies, you might have had someone who was a shaman or a shaman, but they, like everyone else, still had to seek food. And everyone had to do this, so you didn't really have full-time specialization. It's been said about hunter-gatherer societies that they only had one social institution. Can you tell me which one that would be?
Religion.
Only one institution.
Religion?
Not even religion.
Something with food.
What'd you say?
Family.
Family. Everything revolves around kinship. So everyone's doing the same thing, so there really isn't the potential for there to be a lot of institutions. You don't have people specializing in much. Everyone's doing much the same thing. Shaman can get a little prestige from being a little more attuned to the spiritual world of animism. The belief in these societies being that you have the world around you just enchanted. Spirit of the forest, spirit of the wind, spirit of the river, spirit of the trees, and the evidence, of course, is all around you. The wind blows, leaves blow around, they move, you're spooked. You're probably in these societies much more attuned to the weather and patterns because your survival depends upon it. So you can imagine living in a world where things occur all the time that you can't explain, like lightning all around you that would frighten you. And the conditions around you. This is true up through agriculture, that agricultural peoples even oftentimes are much more attuned to the weather and the earth than more modern peoples are. So anyway, you have this animism in the hunter-gatherer societies, but once you get to the horticultural pastoral, people can specialize, they're freed up, but you also start to see now a rise in inequality. So the hunter-gatherer societies have minimal inequality. They're said to be egalitarian, historically speaking. Once you start getting rising inequality, this 1 to 15 ratio, some people start hoarding some of this surplus that they produce. And along with the surplus material goods that are hoarded by some, you also start to get justifications for it, ideologies, and you start to see non-material culture, things like prestige and honor, start to be taken and given to some individuals more than others. So you start to get a kind of hierarchy of status in these societies. And when you get to the agrarian, agricultural societies after that, that ratio goes from what had now been 1 to 15 to 1 to 50. So you see a threefold jump there in the productive value. So there you see the societies exploding. Some of the largest agricultural societies throughout history have numbered over 1 million people. And they've numbered millions, into the millions. Yes?
Am I correct in inferring that those surpluses were not used for the group, for the benefit of the group? They were people who hoarded for personal consumption?
That's for the most part, that's correct, but I hate to say that as an absolute, because if you get, there's sort of an interplay between the amount that you get and how much it's distributed and spread. I would imagine, I can't refer to any kind of research on this, but I would imagine that there would be some diversity in how much it's hoarded, how much inequality there is even among agricultural societies. So some benevolent kings might distribute it a little more than others. Sometimes if you have enough productive value, some of it just sort of trickles around. So you can't help but have the whole population benefit from it. Other things come into play too, that these societies also look after their own interests, and so that sometimes necessitates spreading some of the wealth around. And that's one of the reasons why when you look at the horticultural pastoral societies, you do see conflict emerge where they start to engage in some limited warfare. You might see a tribe raid another village, and they might capture some people and make temporary slaves out of them, but they don't have them as heritable slaves. They don't keep them permanently. They usually let them go after a while. And one explanation that's been given for that is that it's too expensive in these societies, so to speak, to hold them as slaves. You've got to feed them, provide a certain level of sustenance for them, and it really, they're not productive enough to do that, so they let them go. But when you get to agricultural societies, that's where you really start to see heritable slavery. It becomes a full-time institution like we had in this country. When we were colonial, we were agrarian. Yeah.
The reason I asked the question, I wanted to know if those societies were farsighted, whether they were looking ahead and thinking ahead. The biblical account of Joseph and that story. So I always understood that this was something new to them. That he said, stock up and think of what's going to happen in the future. Well, did they see into the future? Did they think? Or did they live in a more day-to-day kind of survival mode?
Yeah, I'm not sure. I mean, that's a good question. I don't really know the direct answer to that. Yeah.
It seemed to be difficult for wealth to accumulate in an agricultural society since the product can rot.
Yeah.
And you'd have to either sell it right away, which means somebody had to have enough whatever to buy it.
Right.
And so it seems like that wouldn't be the place where wealth would diverge very much.
Well, a couple of things to kind of respond to that. One is, I hadn't gotten to it yet, but when you get to agricultural societies, this expression necessity becomes a mother of invention. Really applies here. You get the wheel, you start getting irrigation, writing numbers, and you can think about how there starts to be a pressure, systemic pressure on these systems to come up with some way to meet these needs. And one of them is the wheel allows for that. The wheel allows you to travel across expanding geographical territories. And once you do that, after a while, foods start going bad. You can't really travel well with foods and things, spices that may, not last in a hot environment. So you start to see money emerge in these systems. Money allows someone to travel across a vast empire, and as long as it's recognized politically within that environment, you can get your goods met in a local environment, not have to carry as much stuff. So some of these things that would make these societies work get developed either through diffusion or invention or discovery in agricultural societies. Agricultural, if you look at the etymology of it, means a flowering of culture. So you get all these novel things. But another part of the answer is that I think that they, in some sense, they don't. There starts to be some limitations on these societies. So yeah, there are difficulties, and they don't always develop everything that they need. But yeah. Yeah.
It would just seem like if you're going to have a divergence in wealth, poor and rich in a society, you need to have people who have assets that don't go bad.
Right.
Which maybe would be money or gold or something that's manufactured that stays nice.
Yeah, another thing I left out, another thing I should mention about this is that the primary source of inequality in agricultural societies isn't really wealth anyway. It's really status. So in a sense, that's what I was saying with that second point I made, that you have a point. One way to sort of think of this is if you look at some of the monarchs of agricultural societies in recent history, just a couple of centuries ago, 1700s, and maybe even today around the world, the material standard of living of the elites is probably no greater than a middle-class person or a working-class person in the United States today. So if that makes you feel any better, if you feel like you're poor sometimes, you can think you're living like an elite would have a couple of centuries ago in Austria or someplace. But the difference between you and that person was they had awesome godlike prestige, which you don't, or I don't, in today's society. So in a sense, you're right. There is a limit on how much wealth distinguishes the elites and the masses, but it's prestige. Now, when you get to early industrial societies, now, you can kind of think about Karl Marx, why he might develop the ideas he did about class conflict. You start to see wealth inequality explode with the rise of these robber barons and the elites. That's the kind of wealth he's experiencing when he's walking around London. He's seeing, for the first time, this enormous growth in material difference between the elites and the masses. So he thinks material culture is the root of all class conflict, something that oversimplifies class, most sociologists would say today, but nevertheless that makes sense given what he's witnessing. And then when you get to mature late industrial capitalist societies, you start to get power. Max Weber, a sociologist, pointed out that power becomes a distinctive feature of social class, so bureaucracy grows. And now you have someone like the Federal Reserve chair who can raise the lowest interest rates, and that can prevent or allow millions of young people to get homes. So you have these bureaucrats who don't always have that much income and wealth, not compared to what you would think given their position in society in terms of their status and power. The salary of the President of the United States is, puts him or her, it's usually him now, have had a woman president, in the top 1% of American income earners. There are many, many more people that have greater incomes than the Supreme Court justices and the President of the United States, even if you include all the perks and benefits they get. A regular entertainer, a ball player for the Yankees or the New York Jets might make a lot more than they do. So again, the difference, it becomes one of power. And there are indicators of this, like even in newspapers. One little neat sociological indicator is to look at how we place people's obituaries in newspapers now. If you go back to, say, Sam Walton, when he died in Walmart, and you look at where they place him in the New York Times versus you look at where they would place someone like Rockefeller, when David Rockefeller, when he passed away. In the old days, they would put someone like that on the front page of the New York Times, and they'd take up over half the page. Now, when these wealth, powerful wealth gentlemen die, they're in the back of the newspaper now. They're not usually put on the front page, and if they are, they don't take up so much space. And that's kind of an indicator of the decline in the wealth differences between elites and masses, but power differences become pertinent. Now again, just to jump forward here, when you get into post-industrial societies, you start getting the decline of unions, service-based economy, and so on, and then you start seeing material inequality rising again. So in a way, some of Marx's ideas, you rework them, are a little bit more applicable, some say, to a post-industrial service economy. But anyway, notice you get the 1-to-50 ratio with agriculture. I hadn't said the ratio for industrial societies in the 1700s in Europe, mid-1800s in the United States. The ratio there is 1 to 5,000. So you get, again, 1 to 3, 1 to 15, 1 to 50 in agricultural, and then 1 to 5,000 in industrial societies. So notice that you get a movement away from animate sources of energy in agriculture, beasts of burden and humans sometimes, and you start getting electricity, power, coal, different kinds of inanimate sources of energy driving the economy. That's much more productive, produces awesome inequality materially. And then you start to see something interesting occur with inequality. So you start out with the egalitarian hunter-gatherer societies. If I were to mark it up here, and you can see it, if we were to graph it, you would see it being really low here. And then you see it rise. Inequality rises with each society type I mentioned: horticultural, pastoral, short-term slavery, but not heritable, agriculture, where you have awesome inequality. You have women becoming property, elites controlling all the property. And it's the highest that you see in history among agricultural and also early industrial societies. But once these industrial societies mature, the inequality reverses and starts going down, starts declining. And it goes down a good bit. You can think about why that is. You start to see that democracy emerges, and you start to see power being taken back by the masses of people and used to benefit them. Good trivia question. When did we get the right to form unions in the United States? Like early 1930s, I don't know the exact year, but 31, 32, Great Depression. Things like that reduce the amount of inequality when you have unionization. Then also you get certain movements like the civil rights movement, which reduce it in other ways. The feminist movement reduce gender inequalities. So you see it declining for a while. Never goes back to being completely egalitarian though. And then with post-industrial, you start going back up with it again, rising inequality again. You know?
Well, what accounts for that? Why does technology leave people behind? What leaves people behind?
Part of the answer is that technologies often are adopted by the people that already have the most to begin with, so they just exacerbate the already existing inequalities. That's one of the reasons. But technology isn't the only reason why the inequality rises. That's part of it. In today's post-industrial society, people tend to marry people with similar class background, and the more money you had to begin with, if you're marrying someone like yourself, that alone increases inequality. So a person with a $100,000 income marrying someone else with $100,000 is going to magnify the inequality in the society, since someone with $20,000 marrying someone with $20,000, $15,000 income, you see how that magnifies inequality. And again, when you move from a society that manufactures things, you all know several decades ago, a typical white male could finish high school, or maybe not even that, and get a job in a factory and support a whole family with that. With a knowledge-based economy, what you get is a proliferation of a lot of jobs that don't pay what they used to, that have minimal or no benefits. And to get the few remaining jobs that do pay well and give you upward mobility, you have to have extensive education for that, which you didn't have to have all that education when your salary or your income was based on your muscle power a few decades ago. Now it's based on mental power, and that increases inequality. So technology, but other things too, all play a role in this. All right, so that's an overview of these societies. I want to go back to religion. I've said a few things about hunter-gatherer societies. We mentioned animism, shaman. When you get to horticultural and pastoral, horticultural societies and pastoral both have two new elements you see added to religion. One of them is the idea of God as creator. And that may sound surprising that I would say that I'm really saying that hunter-gatherer societies did not have an idea of a creation myth, God as creator, but that's true. As best as known, hunter-gatherer societies, those that are untouched by modern ideas at least, did not see time in a linear sense, but they saw time being a cyclical fashion, and as best as reported by anthropologists, don't have the concept of an origin and an end, a beginning and an end. So if you don't see time there being a beginning and there being an end in the future, there's no need to have a creation story. And I always find that very fascinating.
Well, how did they deal with death?
In terms of beliefs?
Yeah. I mean, how did they, obviously they'd be sad if someone in their little band of family died, but how would they explain what happened?
I don't know how each member would explain the actual physical death, but the second thing I was going to mention was ancestor worship. I don't know if that plays a role in what you're answering your question. So God is creator, the first thing, and the second one, ancestor worship. You see in these societies the worshiping of ancestors, which of course sounds very unusual to modern peoples, but you have to recall that in these traditional societies, even in agricultural societies, as people get older, they typically gain more prestige as they get older, rather than less. And that's because these societies don't really change very much. The society you know as an old man or woman is the same, almost exact society you knew as a child. So the longer you live, the more useful knowledge you accumulate over time. Sometimes we refer to that as wisdom. And so the knowledge you have as an older person is not outdated. It's still very useful even for the young people. So when I talk to my students, most of whom are very young, freshmen and sophomores in college, I always, just to make the point more stark, I say you get cooler and cooler as you get older. You don't get old-fashioned, you don't get out of date, you get cooler and cooler. Everyone wants to be around you. And if you think about it, someone who's like the sort of the matriarch of the family, of the clan, old woman or old man, they're the coolest of all. And once they die, you're almost worshiping them already before they die. It's just a tiny step from seeing them as so venerable and so awesome and prestigious and cool to now just going that next step and worshiping them, because you might believe that they still are around and they still see you and they enchant the world around you, but their physical body is no longer present.
Hey, can I take you home with me?
Yeah. And, you know, and just a corollary of this, as ought to be obvious, in modern societies, the pace of social change rapidly picks up, so knowledge gets outdated very quickly, and so the knowledge you learn, a skill, whether it be a job or something practical, doesn't apply a few years later. And so we tend to lower the prestige associated with aging, and we develop a cult of youth. And then we start saying crazy expressions like fighting aging. Fighting, as though wrinkles are a bad thing. Wrinkles would be a badge of honor and a good thing in very traditional societies. So it's kind of sad when you think about it. And, you know, obviously our ageism.
I was wondering, does this explain why my family is rather dismissive of what I know?
Probably, yeah. They're a product of our society. Our society is dismissive of
there had to be some reason.
Of older people. Yeah. The time in a person's life cycle where they have usually the most prestige is middle age. And it differs by gender too, as you might all expect. But for middle-aged men, that's the time when pretty much your material, traditionally your material wealth, your prestige, and sometimes your power, like your family, intra-family power, all kind of line up in middle age. But you're less prestigious and less powerful and more dependent when you're a child. And then when you get older, we throw away the elderly in our societies. You know, elder abuse is a major problem. So
when did ancestor respect disappear? Which level of?
Well, you see that maintained to a large degree right on through agriculture, but certainly by the time you get industrial societies, you start to see the rapid pace of social change pick up, and then you see ageism increase, and we devalue aging. So I would say industrial societies is the real link to that. So going back to these horticultural societies and pastoral, so you have God as creator and ancestor worship. Pastoral societies uniquely add a third element, not seen in the horticultural, and that is the interventionist God. I like to call it God as micromanager. The God who will hear your prayers and help you win the AFC championship on Sunday. or God who will intervene and let the crops grow better for you this year, or who will heal an illness that you have, or some other kind of favor for you. Or in the case of something like, you know, in some Native African religions, or voodoo, maybe even harm someone else. so that can go both ways. But even the kind of harm that we think of affiliated with voodoo, in a sense, is still similar in that it restores an injustice, restores a kind of balance to someone's personal wrong that has been done to them. So again, you see this interventionist God. And I have to tell you a little anecdote on this. When I was living in Alabama, one of my favorite examples of this, there used to be this kicker for the University of Alabama, and this is years ago. I don't even remember the guy's name, but he was quoted in the Birmingham News saying, they asked him why he thought he was so successful as a kicker, and he said when he kicked the ball, he could see Jesus in the goalpost. Jesus was in the goalpost. That's a rough quote of what he said. And I remember when I was reading that, I remember thinking to myself, how literally does he mean that? Like, does he see something we don't see, or he's speaking figuratively? But it's kind of hard to tell, isn't it, with this interventionist idea of God. But notice that that's something we still have today. And it's said that one reason we do still in modern societies, where you have the monotheistic faiths of Judaism, Islam, Christianity, seeing God as kind of an interventionist in form, is because all three of those religions were born in pastoral societies in the Middle East. And you can see evidence of that in the Old Testament, the Hebrew Bible, either one. In Psalms, the Lord is my shepherd, I shall not want. The leader of a church is called a pastor. Sometimes the people in the church are called the flock. There's all kinds of pastoral language in the Old Testament that you see. So anyway, you still have those ideas that have maintained themselves, but this interventionist God, this idea of God as being all-powerful. Now, to step back a second to horticultural societies, some of them maintained a high status for women quite a bit. So I'm simplifying a bit to collapse a horticultural and pastoral together, but they maintain a high status for women, and they focused often on the moon as a central element in the sky rather than the sun, which becomes more salient with agrarian societies. So what do you think the link is between the high status of women and the moon in horticultural societies? And for that matter, goddess worship. What's that?
Menstrual cycle.
Menstrual cycle. Yeah, so all these things are linked together, and we even have an expression in modern English for this. We talk about Mother Earth. The earth is a mother. The earth is a giver of life. And notice that the moon goes in a full cycle roughly every 30 days. Same too with the menstrual cycle. These things are probably correlated in the heads of people in these societies, and they did for several thousand years have goddess worship in these societies. And some of those are quite fascinating. Barbara Ehrenreich, if any of you know who she is, has written about some of this. She's one of my favorite writers. In one of her books, she was talking about how we view hunting, how we might have taken a modern view of hunting animals and imposed it on past societies and distorted what hunting might have been like in the past. There's some increasing evidence that hunting was a cooperative group activity among the earliest societies, hunter-gatherers. And the way we, in modern societies, view hunting is through what is called a poacher model. So you see someone sneak up quietly on an animal, usually a man, is the way we envision it, and then stab or spear the animal and bring it back to the tribe, and the woman is portrayed and the children are all near the fire back home. But they're finding increasing evidence that entire groups would hunt, and they would do things like drive animals off of a cliff or make loud noises and drive them around a cave or some kind of something that blocks the view of people, and then throw a net on them. And they found some fossils showing several thousand years ago these women who were in the same area where the bones of the animals were, and all these things are linked together where they think that women were participating in hunting, and also some present hunter-gatherer societies, babies are brought along. The crying of babies is not necessarily a bad thing if you time it right. And the baby starts crying, and then that scares animals, so the whole tribe makes noise, moves the animals, and then it's a collective enterprise rather than a private one. But again, that she was writing in the context of sexism. How we in a sexist society, you reinterpret history and reinterpret everything in a way that's beneficial for the dominant group, namely men. So she was talking about how this is a sexist distortion of hunting in past societies. Now also we can think about, if you look at old societies being more polytheistic, notice with hunter-gatherer societies you have animism, all these little invisible spirits that enchant the world, but you don't worship these spirits in hunter-gatherer societies. They're your invisible peers. So notice the correlation between everyone having roughly equal status in the group. No one tells someone what to do. Everything's negotiated cooperatively. They almost never engage in war. If they run into another hunter-gatherer society that's foraging on the same territory, at most they might expect the tribe to ask permission to forage on their land, and they'll almost always grant it, because they don't want to usually fight. Fighting is a waste of energy and resources, even if they're not aware of the scientific reason behind it. Fighting comes to be, through something called cultural integration, dysfunctional for these societies in a practical sense. So notice the connection there. Many spirits, you don't worship them, they're just your equals. And then when you get to the societies with rising inequality, horticultural, pastoral, you still have polytheistic, but they start to take on power, just like the people in the society do. And then by the time you get to agricultural societies, the sun has taken the place of the moon. The year becomes a main unit of time, and months become a division of that. Then you see God as being male-like in these monotheistic religions. God becomes male-like. There's a strict hierarchy: God, angels, sometimes humans, fallen angels, a devil or devils. So, and then notice in agricultural societies with that extreme inequality, at the same time that people are bowing down to kings, the awesome inequality in their own society, becoming prostrate to kings, notice that's almost identically the posture used to worship God in some monotheistic faiths. Bowing down, worshiping, and so on. So the point I'm trying to make here is notice how it seems to me, just speaking for myself, it seems to me that gods are a projection of your society. That's not an original thought that I've had, but notice sociologically how you can make that case, and anthropologically how you can make that case. That as the societies gain more and more inequality, as males take on more power, that metallurgy in agriculture is thought by a couple of researchers to be the main link to men taking over all the power. And then maybe I should explain that a little bit, but once you get in agricultural societies, the domination of women, notice how the god is seen as being male-like in form. So it very much looks like religion mirrors society. Even Karl Marx, back in the 1800s, was aware of this connection. He didn't know all the details that we know now, but he had the right idea. And that led him to think that religion is a sigh. It's an aspiration it's a projection of ourselves. Freud thought the same thing too. Sigmund Freud picked up on this connection. Yes.
Just a brief aside. How did the transition take place between women being worshipped and becoming property? I mean, why would they even let themselves? Why?
Okay. Yeah. Let me sort of more generally answer that and what that metallurgy does. I don't know about the property specific portion of your question, but just why women lose so much power. The two researchers who have done work on this is Helen Fisher. She's really well known, cited in the press a lot, and Elise Boulding, the researchers on this. What they point out is that when you look at pastoral societies, you had a division of labor between men and women, and you did that even in hunter-gatherer societies. Men, you did the hunting, although again we're questioning that now. Women, the gathering of vegetation, but what women did was not less prestigious than what men did. In fact, it was possibly in some cases more prestigious because women were providers of most of the calories to the diet. So men were not the breadwinners in those societies. Once you get to the pastoral society, you still have this kind of division going on. Men are the ones herding the animals. What they see in most of these, George Murdoch's looked at this, men are herding most of these animals and men are doing some of the metallurgy, but again, neither of those tasks is that much more prestigious than what the women are doing. But it's thought by these two researchers, Elise Boulding and Helen Fisher, who looked into this, that apparently some man somewhere, as simple as this, thought to take that metal when they're warming it up and forming it into different shapes and form a big hook out of it. And since they're already dealing with animals, it's not a step to just say, hey, let's put this on this animal, see what we can do. And that becomes the birth of agriculture. And at that point, men take over almost all of the food production away from women. And women, at that point, then, they research found, are doing just as much work as they did before. And in fact, in some cases, more work than they did before, but the value of what they're doing becomes seen as secondary. They become sort of like secretaries, in a sense. You know, how secretaries are seen, I'm not saying they are, but they're seen, female secretaries, as an appendage of the real job. And so we in part justify lower pay from secretaries. You know, that if it weren't for, if you're like a legal secretary, if it weren't for the lawyer that a female secretary works for, there would be no job for the secretary. And so these women are weeding the fields, they're bringing out water, they start doing what we think of as domestication. The tasks around the kitchen and the home. It's thought that a lot of that goes back to agriculture, not hunter-gatherers like a lot of people assume, but to agriculture. So it's as simple as metallurgy. There's a technology that really dramatically increased inequality to the detriment of women, metallurgy. And then men take over the food supply and they get prestige. And then what happens is, of course, when you go to industrial societies, another factor that goes into this is that in hunter-gatherer societies, one reason they think that men would do more of the hunting, you know, if they did any more of the hunting, would be just that cultural integration. Men have, on average, greater upper body strength. And so it might be functional for society, for a hunter-gatherer society, for men to do more of the hunting in that sense, just because it's practical. Once you get to industrial societies, energy is driving the economy. So whatever physical strength differences you have on average between men and women becomes outdated, and even more so in a knowledge economy. There's no average advantage that men have over women when it comes to thinking and creativity and so on. But notice the ideas that justify the inequality are still around. Are very old. Ideas don't just go away very easily. Sometimes they persist over centuries. So you still have ideas about men's work and women's work and what they're both good at and so on. They go way back. I know, does that kind of help a little bit? You know, I don't have a specific answer to what you asked, but that's what they attribute it to. And you can read more about that if you want. Yeah.
You mentioned before that there's a correlation between seeing things in a linear way and having a creation myth come up. Does that mean that, and I don't know whether to call them religions, but let's say grouping, like Eastern movements or whatever, which do not have a linear approach to life, they don't have a creation? They don't see a creator?
Yeah. Are you talking about? I may have missed part of what you said. Are you talking about Eastern?
Eastern. I don't know whether to call them religions or not, but
like in China,
they see things in cyclical, ways.
Yeah.
So there's no creator involved in that?
I hesitate to say no, because I know in Hinduism there certainly are gods, and I think I don't know about creators. I can't remember enough about Hinduism to know if any of the gods have a creator idea attached to them. I do know, like in China, there was some, I read something years ago, some indigenous part of China where the people had literally no belief in God. And Confucianism really is not like a religion. It's very naturalistic view of the world. So it's sort of, in a way, similar to atheism, we might say, some might say. But I don't know. I don't know. That's a good question. When you apply that to these more modern societies that come after the hunter-gatherers, I don't know exactly how to explain that.
Confucianism has to do with reaching a higher level for yourself, something like that. The Tao, the ideal.
I had to plead. I don't know. I'd have to
because I'm wondering what's going on in China today. Is there any kind of religious association with the technological revolution going on? I mean, is there any linkage there?
Well, yeah,
they referred, they recently had several interviews with people about the educational advances they're making in Shanghai, especially in certain places, and they keep mentioning Confucius.
Yeah.
So
Nicholas Kristof had I don't know if you saw that column the other day about that, but that's something.
He lived there about 20 years, I think.
Right.
12 years.
Right. That really, Max Weber would be the one that you go back to as the person who first espoused that idea that certain cultures foster greater or lesser achievements. That all goes back to Max Weber. Weber is the one who said that class is not simply a matter of wealth inequality, material inequality, but also non-material. And again, he traces that back to his thesis on the Calvinists. That the Calvinists had, because of their specific belief in predestination, they looked at money accumulation very differently than most traditional, which would have been at that time Catholic Christians did. Catholic Christians had the view that a lot of wealth is sinful and corrupting, and tradition ruled the day. But the Calvinists actually looked at money accumulation as a sign of God's blessing and virtue, because they were so obsessed with who's going to heaven and who's condemned to go to hell. They had no way to directly know that, of course, but they found an indirect way to relieve themselves of their anxiety, and that is to look for favor in this world. If you're, if you have good crops and your kids are growing up to be healthy and you're having good fortune in this life, then God must be smiling on you. And you can see the link to the prosperity gospel. So all of a sudden becoming rich is not a sign of being corrupt, it's a sign of going to heaven. And someone who's poor, a homeless person, a beggar, is someone who's been condemned by God. So they have a very different idea of charity. The Calvinists don't necessarily emphasize the charity aspect the way Catholics did. And so the Calvinists would take their money, put it back in their business, and they start exploding it, and they start developing bureaucratic principles, rationalizing, standardizing the tasks, removing the job from the personality of the person who does the job, like a training manual. Accountants, the profession of accounting originally meant keeping track of a person's moral deeds. With the Calvinists, over time, of course, it's been secularized, and we say now it's keeping track of money. So that all goes back to certain cultures foster ideas, and cultures spread across classes too. So that's a lot of studies in health. My background in sociology was medical sociology. You'll see that Weber was the one who really showed that a characteristic that a class develops, like playing soccer among the working classes in England, over time that can spread and you can start to see other people do it. Go back to the 70s, jogging, which people do all the time now, was seen as an upper, middle, and upper class phenomena in this country, and a lot of working class people saw jogging as being pretentious. If you went out and you jogged down the street, a lot of working class people would see you as being pretentious, but that's no longer the case now. A lot of working class people jog today. So characteristics can spill outside of the classes in which they originate. That all goes back to Weber's more sophisticated view of what class is. Yeah.
Seems to me left out of the story from prehistory through history, through post-history perhaps, is no place for what seems to me is a very strong characteristic of people, aggression. Rather than just producing food or gathering it or using a machine to make it, people take what others have. And we know enough examples of Vikings, we know other marauding societies. Do they fit in chronologically in the outline?
Yeah, I think the Vikings, I'd have to check this to be sure myself, but the Vikings I think were an post-agricultural people. So it's best I understand. I'm no authority on them by any means, but I think they had a warlike culture and so on, but they were certainly not hunter-gatherers. So the type of society you have can minimize any inherent tendency towards aggression or maximize it. Some societies are what we, in our ethnocentric fashion might say are very, Yanomamo Indians, a famous example, what we in the United States would think of as a very aggressive society. They probably wouldn't see it that way. So I think, I think if we're talking about human nature, which is hard to pinpoint, I think there's as much evidence that we're altruistic as aggressive. I think we humans have both. And it's a complicated mixture of individual genetic variation, but also the society, rewarding or discouraging.
Well, it's pretty clear to me, I've had this theory for a long time, that the reason Europe was fair-skinned and Africa dark-skinned was not just the development of melanin, but the fact that when anybody moved across the Mediterranean, they were disposed of.
Disposed of?
Yeah, they were either driven back or killed.
Yeah, but the skin color would still have to be a function of intermarriage, like mating and swapping genes, and a lot of that occurred in the Middle East. But also moving and migrating around, just the local environments operating on us after we were already fully formed Homo sapiens. So, so the skin color thing is pretty, I think by now, kind of, there's a consensus view on that, how that came about. There's evolution on the environment. If you go back to primates that had furry bodies, of course, if you look under like a chimpanzee's fur, what you'll see is white skin. Skin's kind of light. And once we start moving out of trees in the past and living in a savanna environment, then you start to see the reduction of fur, and then the skin starts becoming darker. Melanin's selected for, and you see dark skin. But then once humans move away from the equator, then you start seeing it go back to light skin again. But that occurs within a few tens of thousands of years. So that's the whole evolutionary.
You said in the beginning about the Bible Belt.
Yes, I was going to go to that just in a second.
Okay. I'm sorry, I keep jumping ahead of you.
That's fine. One more thing I want to mention about just the religion in these societies, I just didn't want to leave out, is that if you look at the Genesis creation story, some scholars have pointed out that where we nowadays talk about God as a singular entity, I created this on the third day and I created that on the fourth day, that the original translations from Hebrew were, we created this on the third day, and we created that on the fourth day. And of course you see this stuff in the Old Testament about idol worship, and I'm a jealous God, you shall have no other God before me, indicating polytheistic roots of Judaism. So you see Judaism over time move in this fashion I described too, from being polytheistic to becoming monotheistic over time. So there's a lot of interesting religious stuff there that you see. This, again, this mirroring of the society in the religion, both in terms of male inequality, societal inequality generally, and of course polytheistic and monotheistic. Belief in life after death, that's gone down. So there's some evidence of secularization. You can point to another one that would suggest we're becoming more religious, like religious affiliation, going to church. Religious affiliation is higher now than it was in the mid-1800s. They actually had some records on that, and they did a study on that. So I'm not saying that there aren't some indicators of becoming more secular, but there isn't enough evidence to really say that it's one or the other. At best, it's a mixed picture.
That religious affiliation, is that a worldwide view?
Religious affiliation?
Yeah.
Well, when I say no, it's not. I mean the United States.
United States?
Yeah.
Now, assumedly, I think Catholic religious affiliation has gone down, hasn't it?
Yes.
Over the last 2 decades?
Right. And other...
Which religions are they talking about?
Well, Catholicism, but also mainline Protestant denominations. And I was going to say something about that in a little bit. So yeah, so you do see a drop in church membership and affiliation among the dominant, large, old, established church groupings, but you see an increase in both fundamentalist church groupings, Seventh-day Adventists, Jehovah's Witnesses, Church of God, Assemblies of God, Church of Christ, and New Age religious beliefs. Those are increasing. So it's like any dropping out that we're seeing is almost being replaced, almost on a one-for-one basis, it seems, by people clinging to religion. There was a recent study of how many houses of worship there are in the United States per 1,000 people. The answer is 1. There's a house of worship, and they included mosques, temples, and churches, Christian churches. 1 house of worship for every 1,000 people. That's the highest of all industrialized countries. So you all have probably heard that the United States really stands out in a sense that we're more religious than other, very developed countries, and we're sort of an anomaly. There are a few other countries that are pretty religious, Poland, Ireland, a little bit more religious than average, but for the most part, we're an outlier. We're actually more religious than some middle and low income countries. I think Costa Rica is an example of a country where the people, I think, if I remember the data, Costa Rica is a country where the people are a little bit more secular overall than we are. But Costa Rica is a middle income country, a lot more poor than we are.
I've heard some people advance the idea that maybe that's why we're not, our students are not doing as well in science. Maybe there's some kind of reaction there.
Yeah, certainly.
Greater religion, less success in science.
Right. Yeah, I definitely think so. When it comes to either whether it be our opposition in this country to clean needle exchange programs, a program that's proven to reduce hepatitis and the spread of HIV among drug addicts, we've never been able to implement that on a national level, primarily because of religious opposition to it. Abstinence-only sex education. I mean, as far as I know, we're the only industrialized country that could possibly come up with the idea of the silver ring thing. You all know about the silver ring thing? That's at these big mega churches throughout the West Coast and the South and the Midwest, where they have a ceremony where the father puts a ring on his daughter's finger and she vows to leave it there until her husband takes it off, and they make Christly love on her wedding night. I mean, only in this country could we come up with something so crazy like that. So yeah, I think there is a link. And global warming, I think a lot of global opposition to global warming is driven from the top by energy interests, but the mass of people who buy into it are people who are not very scientifically literate. I know some of you may disagree with me on that, but that's my conclusion on that, for what it's worth. But I do want to say that this secularization thesis also applies in some places better than others. It applies a little better to Western Europe. Not so much here. So Western Europe is pretty secular. Some of you may have seen the news surveys they do from time to time. They show the percent of people who are atheists in Britain and France, and it's unbelievable how much more secular some of these countries are in Europe than we are here. Even in Latin America, there's some places like in Argentina where there's broad swaths of the population that are losing their religion recently and giving it up. And I want to ask you to think about why that might be the case. This Rodney Stark that I referred to earlier has done some work on that. Think about the different histories of Europe and the United States. And think about where the term separation of church and state, what country is that most closely connected to? Phrase separation of church and state.
United States.
United States, right? So the United States, ironically, a nation that's never had an ecclesia, a true state church, not on a large-scale state church. Now, the early colonies, they did try to set up some state churches, some of the early colonies, but on a national level, we never really had an entrenched feudalistic state church, but they did in Europe, and still do, nominally. Even England, I think, still does have Church of England. I think people there still are born into it. Sweden, that's the case, although you can opt out of it. But notice that in these societies that had this tight connection between the monarch and the religious, the church, once democracy comes about in Europe, Rodney Stark, the sociologist, says, when they threw off the monarchs, they threw off everything with it, and that included religion. In the United States, what we had is sort of a marketplace of religion. We had this nominal and formal separation of church and state, and that led to a kind of vibrancy, a kind of competition that pushes religions to try to recruit a lot. So you have a very vigorous fundamentalism. Part of that is said to be a frontier heritage thing too, where people would travel and you had to convert people in a really rapid fashion to your religion, and that led to charisma. You had charismatic leaders who would try to convert people on the western frontier. But notice, without a church-state establishment, these religions are all competing with each other, and they start marketing. Religion is heavily marketed in the United States, and anything that's marketed well will lead to people belonging to it. Marketing works. Not all the time, but it works to a good degree. So ironically, where we have church-state separation, religion has more adherence here through this market approach. But in Europe, where you didn't have such competition for recruits, it was just thrown away, and people see it as a relic of a time in the past. One other thing to throw in here is immigration. One reason why the United States is probably not only now still very religious, but will be for the foreseeable future, is we still have high rates of immigration. A lot of the immigration is coming from Latin America, where people are bringing their own very entrenched family religious beliefs here, and that keeps our religious our population quite religious. California, for example, if you were to take out the immigration in California, California would be a very secular state. But when you include the immigration, the religious affiliation of people who are newly arrived immigrants, California's in the middle on measures of religiosity. So immigration can make a big difference. And I want to go to the second question about a Bible Belt. I mentioned that Rodney Stark had challenged the idea that the South is a Bible Belt. So let's think for a moment about how you measure religiosity. The way you measure or operationalize anything, you got to think of everything to do it really well. You could do something like ask people, how often do you attend church in the last month or the last week? And that's, gets at some of what religiosity is, but obviously that can be flawed, right? There are a lot of people who go to church who are not devout, not religious, and there are people who are very devout who never go to church. People that might be homebound. Always, when I talk on this subject in class, I've mentioned in a very reserved way that my own church I grew up in the South, people used to go to this church and they would have sex, teenagers would have sex in the back of the church because they had these picnic tables and these pits that were below the ground, and that would be a safe place for people to go have sex, if not in their cars, in the church grounds. And people, even in the youth group, there were stories people would have sex, not during church service, but in the church. And right here in New York, you remember, some of you know Opie and Anthony, you remember their famous stunt they had in the what's that church in Manhattan, the Catholic Church? St. Patrick's Cathedral. They did a play-by-play of a couple having sex during the service, and that's what got them kicked off of terrestrial radio way back, and they took time off and then went to satellite radio. So my point is that that's not a perfect measure of religiosity, church going. So another thing that you could add, if you wanted to have a composite measure, would be something more private, like how often do you pray in private each week? So you're not trying to impress anyone if you're doing it in private. How important to you subjectively is religious devotion, or how important is your religion to you? That's an important question. Sometimes those subjective questions where you just say yourself how important religion is to you can be very predictive of a lot of things. I know in medical sociology, if you ask people to state how healthy they think they are, rate your health. Excellent, good, fair, poor. Turns out that correlates very highly with objective measures of health. So it can be used as a proxy for taking a person's blood pressure and cholesterol and other kinds of things. You ask people how healthy you are, pretty much they get it right.
And don't do the rest of the stuff.
Sometimes you don't have to. Yeah.
I always thought that when people are asked whether they go to church or not, they tend to lie and always report that they go a lot more. And I think that there's been some, I forget what organization, actually went to churches and counted people in the pews to see what the real numbers were. And the numbers are very low.
There was
lower than what people report.
There's a sociologist in Ohio that did this. They did this in a community. That's probably what you're thinking about, where they actually had people go and check the rolls and actually count the people, and they compared that with what people said in the survey, and they actually used the difference to calibrate other studies. They can figure how much people lie, and use it to adjust for lying on similar surveys. And I used to know those numbers. It was like a third of people, I think, I may have this off, a third of people said they went to church on a weekly basis, and then it turned out to be less than a quarter or 20%. I forget the exact numbers, but something like that.
I would say a more accurate way of finding how religious people are, really, is if a person's in a car accident, how many people ask for a priest versus how many people ask for an ambulance.
Yeah, but that would not be a perfect measure, because that presumes people have been in a car accident. Most people have not.
I have.
Yeah, and it's a hypothetical, but yeah, I mean it's.
But I would say that would be a real measure of something that's objective.
Okay.
That you can't lie about.
You can be religious and still want an ambulance.
What's that?
You can be religious and still want an ambulance.
Oh no, but I'm saying it's that be an objective way. It would be something objective. Take me to the hospital. Take me to the church.
Yeah, and
last rites or taken to the hospital.
I think what you mean objective, you mean something that would be valid.
Yeah, that you can't make up a story about it.
Yeah. Yes.
In reference to this Bible Belt thing, is it possible that it's not a religious reference, that it's more a political reference?
Yeah, I haven't finished what he's saying. Look, let me go ahead and finish what he's saying, why it's not, and then for now I'm just talking about how you measure religion. So just to make the point, you could ask people, privately pray, how much do they know of the creed or beliefs of their system and so on. So you combine these into a composite measure where you're asking them more than just one thing, like church attendance, and you can measure them. Religiosity, well, when he did this, he ranked all 50 states on a couple of these measures. One of them was religious affiliation. That was one. Then another study he did later, he combined 2 of these measures. But looking at the religious affiliation, he ranked them. And you did find that 3 of the top 10 most religious states in the whole country are in the Bible Belt, in the South. They're Louisiana, Mississippi, and Alabama. Mississippi was number 1, most religious state in the entire country. But it turns out you also had 3 states in the top 10 that were in the Northeast. Anyone guess which ones those were? Most religious state, among the top 10 most religious states in the country, 3 of them are in the Northeast. Which ones were they?
New York, Maryland, Massachusetts.
New York, Massachusetts,
Rhode Island.
Rhode Island, yes. That's the 3. New York, Massachusetts, and Rhode Island. Notice you do have a lot of churches in New York. Now I know what some of you are thinking, well, it's different though. It's not like Southern, I know, but hold on a second. There are a lot of churches, let's just get that down. Because in a lot of places you don't see a lot of churches, not like you do in New York. So there are a lot of churches around. You don't have to go too many blocks to see one.
Especially Brooklyn, there's a lot of them.
Yeah, in the city.
The borough churches it was done. Yeah, that's what they call it.
And again, immigration's part of that picture. You know, New York's historically a place of immigration, but nevertheless. So he says that they're really, the South in these measures is differently religious, but it is religious, but the Northeast is pretty religious too, and different from the South. Obviously, the religion in the South takes on the character of the broader culture there. It's conservative. The religion in the Northeast tends to be more liberal. Catholicism was traditionally linked to the Democratic Party and economic liberalism. Of course, social conservatism, but economic liberalism. A lot of the mainline churches that are more liberal today, you know, the Episcopalians, Presbyterians that have women as priests and more open on this question of gay marriage and gay priesthood, again, these are all centered more so in the Northeast. So he says, you know, that what's different is the quality of the religion, not the fact of there being a religiosity in these places. But what he does contend is the case is what he calls an unchurched belt, and that would be the West Coast. And he includes in that Hawaii and Alaska. If you look at these places, that is sort of the opposite of a Bible Belt. You really see more difference between the South and the West Coast than you see between the South and the Northeast. And he says this reflects the fact that on the West Coast you had, that was the last part of the country that was established and was integrated. So you had a lot of, you know, you had strong institutions on the East Coast that integrated people both in terms of the community but also in terms of worshiping and religion and religious instruction and institutions to help you practice it and so on. Not so much on the West Coast, and also of course the immigration question on the West Coast. You had people living far apart from each other and so on. So notice how a lot of trends in our culture, a lot of changes that occur on the West Coast first. A lot of entrepreneurialism occurs there, and then things spread east, like the casual workday. That, of course, occurred in the high-tech sector of the economy in Silicon Valley and then spread to the rest of the country. Tofu. Tofu was first eaten on the West Coast. The term lifestyle, that's an old term, but its use in popular discourse in the last few decades really picks up in the West and then spreads to the rest of the country. So if you look at these measures of religiosity in the West, if you look at a map and actually had it by like zip code or county, you would see that people just aren't very church-going on the West Coast. But one thing that's a flip side of this that is high is belonging to cults. If you do a mapping of cult membership, you would notice the West Coast is highly coded. So notice that's the mirror image, the flip side of this whole equation, that where people are least integrated socially, they're more open to new ideas, good or bad, including being a member of a cult. So cults tend to be a little bit more entrenched on the West Coast. And he used this whole theory of his, talking about the different levels of social integration, to actually solve another puzzle that people had wondered about. This question of whether being religious, belonging to a church, does it discourage social ills? Does it discourage juvenile delinquency or crime, for example? Turns out that most of the studies in sociology that he looked at, that are out there, said that it does have a deterrent effect. But a few of them don't, but most said they do. Well, he said, let's look at the methodology of all these studies and get rid of the ones where there's some kind of identifiable weakness in the study and so on. So he did that. Turns out when he did this review about 10 years ago, there were 6 good peer-reviewed studies that all were very high quality, methodology was good, sample sizes were large, and so on. So he narrows it down to 6 studies, and there he sees it split down the middle. Half the studies, 3 of them say that it does discourage juvenile delinquency, half of them say it has no effect. So how do you reconcile this? And he put it together here. He looked for where these studies were done. The studies that said it made no difference were all on the West Coast. Oregon, California, I don't remember the exact locations, but they're all on the West Coast. The 3 that said it does have a deterrent effect were scattered throughout the rest of the country. 1 in Tennessee, I think 1 up in the Midwest, 1 on the East Coast somewhere. So this idea of social integration might unlock this puzzle. That if you are on the West Coast and you're very religious, you're like a Bible thumper, you're a fundamentalist, well, people might consider that to be your lifestyle choice, but they don't want you to impose it on them. And you can't appeal to the shared belief in that strong biblical fundamentalism or that conservative religious belief to control of everyone else's behavior. Everything's a lifestyle choice on the West Coast. So people will say, well, that's what you want to do, so be it, but don't tell me what to do. So it's hard to impose it. You have to be a lone, rugged individualist to be very religious on the West Coast. But where you have stronger institutions, higher church-going populations and so on, people can appeal to their shared belief in religion, including on questions of birth control and abstinence only, and should you have sex with your girlfriend or boyfriend or not, and they can use it to control each other. It's like, you're sinning if you do that. Remember what we learned in church. So this is what he says accounts for the difference. It's where they were done. This question of how integrated the populations were that were included in the study. Peter Bierman, a researcher at Columbia University, he's an authority on looking at abstinence-only sex education. Many of you remember in the news when they showed that teenagers who took abstinence pledges were more likely to get an STD, and were actually, over the long term, less likely to be abstinent. They were more likely to engage in oral and anal sex. Do you remember that all that stuff was in the news a few years ago? Well, what he specifically found in his very large survey that he did was that in teenagers that actually pledged to be abstinent until later on, there is in some of them a 6-month deterrence that they put off having sex compared to teenagers who don't for 6 months. But when they do have sex, it comes with an unwelcome side effect. They're more likely to have unprotected sex, and therefore they have pregnancies and STDs are more likely to get because of this. But this 6-month deterrent effect, even that short-term deterrence, is only found, he noticed, in teenagers who live in areas where neither too many nor too few others make such a similar pledge. So let's think that through. Neither too many nor too few make it. So let's imagine you're a teenager in Berkeley, California, and you pledge to be abstinent until marriage because that's an important religious value. Again, you're not going to get any social support for that or moral encouragement for that. People will say, if you want to be a virgin till marriage, more power to you. But you know, that's you. I'm choosing my lifestyle. Good luck. If you're in Flea Hop, Mississippi, making that up, but if you're in an extremely religious community in the deep South somewhere in a small town, where there were cases when I was living in Alabama where Gideons at one point tried to come into classrooms and pass out Bibles. We were always fighting battles down there in Alabama. They have a vigorous free thought movement. Lake Hypatia is in Alabama. There's an active free thought presence there, but we're always fighting our battles. Well, if you're in a small community where everyone's religious and everyone goes to the same church and so on, well, there it doesn't have a deterrent effect either. If you say, I'm a virgin, I'm living out a godly value, well, so what? Everyone else is too. You're just like everybody. But where it might have a 6-month deterrent effect, Peter Bierman found, is when you're in a very complex, diverse high school, like in a suburb, like a Long Island high school or a city somewhere, where you have a lot of cliques. You got the goth crowd, you got the jocks, you got the nerds, you got in the South, the redneck crowd. There's always a crowd of people with Confederate flags, always a little small group in some of these high schools. So you got all these cliques. There, if you pledge to be a virgin, it can be a kind of status symbol. I'm better than those girls. Some people, I'm better than, some females might say, I'm virgin, I'm pure, I'm not like those SLUTS. So that, if you think that way, that encourages you to continue the status in a way. So it has a slight deterrent effect, but again, it ends very shortly, very soon, 6 months later. 80% of all high school seniors have had sex before they graduate. So that's something to keep in mind. 84 out of 5 have had, on a national level, have had sex before they finish, and they're more likely to, it's suggested by this research, to get an STD or become pregnant.
That's countrywide.
Yeah, that's countrywide. Peter Bierman is looking at national data. So that's the puzzle. Yeah.
What was that, STD?
What's that?
Did you say STD?
STD, yeah, sexually transmitted diseases or infections. Yeah.
I went to the wrong high school.
What do you mean? Like meaning what?
Well, I was one of the 1 out of 5 who didn't, I guess.
Who didn't pledge, or didn't keep
Didn't have sex.
Didn't have sex.
And she still regrets it, apparently.
Yeah.
Yeah. One of the things I like to do.
Made up for it.
Have I?
From what I've heard, yeah.
How many of you took a pledge in high school before you were a legal adult at 18? How many of you took a pledge of any kind, like not to drink alcohol until you were legal age, not to do illegal drugs, not to have sex until you were married? Did any of you ever take a pledge like that at all? I guess you all grew up around here.
I took a pledge with...
Yeah. How many raise your hand? Anybody? One?
It was a pledge to my parents that I wouldn't smoke cigarettes.
Okay.
Which I broke.
You broke, okay. In ninth grade health class, I signed a card in my health class. It was passed out to us not to use illegal drugs. So I signed that. I broke it. Smoked some pot a couple times. Yes?
There was no pledge in the 50s. I mean, it was just come down from above, from your parents and from the churches and from everything. You wouldn't have sex.
Yeah. So it's...
you know, before marriage. Or some people did, but I think far fewer than...
or drugs,
well, so, drugs never even came up.
And so a pledge is really little better than a New Year's resolution. It's just a pledge. That's all it is. It's you saying, I hope not to do this or to do that. The fact that you're making a pledge itself says that there's a kind of insecurity about your confidence that you'll uphold it. If it's coming from your families and is strongly valued in your own family and yourself, there's no need to make a pledge. The fact that you're pledging something suggests there's some insecurity about your confidence in being able to carry it out.
Besides which, I mean, who would ever trust the word of a 14-year-old anyway? Oh, I'm never going to do something. I mean, how would you even know when you're 14 or 9th grade, I guess, or 17 or whatever? You don't know.
Right. Did anybody see the New York Times on Tuesday in the science and health section? They had a study on this, that one out of 10 people who said they were abstinent actually had sex, and they proved it by, they took blood samples from them and they found evidence. STDs.
Yeah.
So 1 out of 10 were lying. I can't remember the exact thing in that. It was in Tuesday's paper.
One out of 10 had to be lying because not everybody who has sex has an STD. So.
Yeah.
So
I need to go back and read that. I just glanced at it Tuesday. That they found a high degree of lying about that. But this thing about making pledges, I would tell my students when I used to teach in Birmingham, I'd ask them how many of you took a pledge of any kind, and a lot of them did, of some kind, early on in church, either not to do drugs or alcohol, and a lot of them would raise their hands, and I'd say, okay, how many of you kept it? Keep your hand up, and almost everybody would drop their hand, which taught them a lesson about pledges. So, any other questions about anything? Yes?
I had a general question. You mentioned the progression of belief in the supernatural from totem gods and natural phenomena gods to a monotheism. How well confirmed by reliable studies and so on is this progression?
I'm going to just venture to say pretty established. And I just say that not because I myself go and review journal articles on it, but just because that's cited so widely in textbooks. That doesn't mean that's correct because they're in textbooks, but it appears to me to be a consensus view. You know, it's just widely cited in textbooks. I don't see any debate or dispute over it among anthropologists.
Well, is it a result of observation about various kinds of cultures at those levels?
I think it's a combination of several different pieces. Some of it's actual observation of hunter-gatherer and societies today that are still around. Some of it is from remnants and remains of past cultures. And some of it's through some neat experimental work they can do. They can do all kinds of things now. You know, they even have like DNA. They're doing DNA tests on Neanderthals now. So they have all kinds of different things they piece together using deductive and then inductive experimentation. Deductive reasoning and inductive experimentation. So it's broad. I'm not giving you a specific answer, but I think it's pretty well established. I know that Gerhard Linsky, who I'm most familiar with, he's just a sociologist by training. He's I would say very credible. He cites stuff really well. Very positivistic thinker. You know, he's very rigorous in his science and citation of evidence.
So there are rigorous studies that seem to confirm this progression.
Yeah, but I should qualify that by saying anytime you're looking at what happened in the past, it's more difficult methodologically to do that than asserting what's going on today. You know, that's true, especially when you're talking about behaviors of past cultures. So that is one reason why it's easier to talk about our physical evolution as primates than to talk about sociobiological or evolutionary psychology conclusions, since we can't go and directly observe a lot of the behaviors of past cultures. In fact, are all hunter-gatherer societies today representative of all hunter-gatherer societies that have ever existed? Well, we don't know that for sure, although some researchers would say that hunter-gatherers, because they're so fixed to the earth and to foraging, there aren't potentially mathematically that many ways in which they can be that different from each other. So based on that logic, we probably can assume that most hunter-gatherer societies in the past were a lot like the ones today. Because it's not until you get differentiation and specialization that you get the potential for lifestyles and people differing from each other. In fact, like I said, you only had one society up until really 12,000 years ago. Then you start getting different kinds of societies after that. So,
you had correlated the belief in an interventionist God with the pastoral societies as opposed to agricultural?
Well, pastoral as opposed to horticultural.
Horticultural.
Yeah.
And so what is the explanation specifically?
For why pastoral got the interventionist gods? Off my head, I don't know. I'd have to go look that up and investigate that. I can't remember what the reason for that is.
Okay, but there's theories about it.
Yeah, there's writing about that. And I'm sure a good anthropology, cultural anthropology book would have something on that. Off my head, I can't remember that.
Most of what you spoke about were details of institutional religion. As an atheist, how would sociology handle the supernatural content of a religion?
I would say, if I can speak for most sociologists, and I may not be able to, that as a social science, it would want to know how these beliefs or non-beliefs come about, and what are the consequences of these beliefs or non-belief.
Or what about the truth of those beliefs?
I think you get, depending on who you ask, you get a different answer. Some would say, in fact, I brought a textbook in here that I use in class. John Macionis, the author of one of the most widely used textbooks, would say that a view you hear among a lot of sociologists and anthropologists, that sociology in the social sciences can speak to the consequences of beliefs and values and elements of culture, but they have nothing to say about the ultimate validity of particular beliefs. So that's said by a lot of scientists, right? A lot of scientists say that.
Are you implying there that sociology is not competent to deal with religion?
No.
Only the details of consequences?
Well, I'm saying not just sociology, but all of science. You all know there's this division in all of science. It's not unique to sociology. There are scientists who say that science can study the consequences of groups and our behaviors and this and that, but it cannot test whether God exists, because it's not a falsifiable proposition. There are scientists who say that. Now, there are other scientists like Richard Dawkins, who says that as a scientist he can say that you can be an atheist. So, and I think he reflects a minority view on that. I don't think most scientists would say that, but he says that. I would say that the same thing would apply to sociology. I would say now, what I was describing here about the correlation here, I did make an inference, right? I made an inference. I said it looks like the religion becomes more complex and reflects inequalities just as the society it's associated with does, and we can infer from that the religion is a product of the society. That comes awfully close to me to saying you can establish, based on social science, a position of atheism.
But a lot of what you covered, that sequence of these things, was rather fanciful and I think highly speculative. I don't think there's going to be much evidence that you could bring out to show that this actually happened, because no one was there to see it.
But wait a minute, I may not be understanding you. There are
the different sequences in religious belief that you put in an order,
like animism with hunter-gatherers.
Yeah,
that's not. You can get evidence on that, and there are hunter-gatherer societies today.
But I think what you put together there is going to depend on what your presuppositions are, rather than what the evidence itself is. And if you have a presupposition that certain things happen some way, you're going to have a very hard time not bending the details of the data to fit that presupposition.
Can you give me you're talking in the abstract, give me a specific example. If we wanted to see if hunter-gatherer,
okay, I'm a theist. I believe the Bible.
Okay.
And I think what we see is much more consistent with what the Bible says about early man. and there were iron and bronze workers in the third generation after Adam. Well, now is that fiction? Or is what you have there fiction? I don't think either can be.
Are you denying that the world is more than 6,000 years old?
I'm not fixing 6,000 as the
10,000?
year. Yes.
You're denying?
I have no reason to believe that it's as
All right,
old.
then we don't. Okay,
Yeah, it's really.
Yeah, this is a general science. This is a general science
I
issue.
know that. And I'm trained in science too, so
Right.
I don't.
But listen, I can assure you, anthropologists have gone, and some sociologists, gone and actually done ethnographies with hunter-gatherer societies, and they can observe directly, that what the characteristics of the religious beliefs are. And then that's somehow they've gotten this information. And then there are agricultural societies, and there are horticultural and pastoral, and so this is empirical stuff. I'm telling you, it's not speculative; it's empirical, empirically derived. To be sure,
though.
I'm sorry.
It's today. It's not thousands of years ago.
It's from data that have come from thousands of years ago in some cases. It's not all observing present societies too. It's also looking at,
That's my point.
at the remnants of past societies.
That's where it fails.
It doesn't fail. That's called deductive reasoning.
No.
You deduce and then you infer.
That does not make it right, though. That does not make it true.
It can make it valid, and valid is your
It can make it
measurement.
persuasive, but it doesn't necessarily make it true.
Well, you know.
Talk about agendas.
Well,
I mean, we know lots of things that happened in the past, and we do it through empirical evidence. And it doesn't all have to be observed in one fell swoop. I like to point out when I'm talking about evolution, we don't. No one's observed the Earth go around the sun directly. But we can say if the Earth goes around the sun, the heliocentric theory of the universe, then we ought to be able to observe X. And we can make specific observational things that we go and look at them and observe and then piece the theory of the heliocentric theory of the universe together like a puzzle. So it's based on small observations that all fit together and paint a picture through inductive reasoning. And I would suggest that's what a lot of this stuff comes from here. It's small observations, sometimes directly of societies, a lot of times of stuff that comes from the past, pieced together to make a theory that changes with new information, like I was suggesting with how we hunt. So the idea was that we hunt as poachers. New information, new data from past societies suggests that it was a collective enterprise. That's observation, that's empirical. That's not speculative. But this sounds like a broader science question that you have, that you're raising, which is a little bit beyond.
It's a lot deeper and broad, yes.
Yeah, but I think that there's something to be said for empirical evidence in science.
yeah, and also, I mean, some of the theories that have been posited about ancient societies, for which we have very few, if any, records, you can still, like with any science, at least posit a theory, try to think of a way that you can falsify that theory, try to find a way that you can prove it false, or just, I mean, it's a soft science, but it's still a science. There's still data.
And I took a human evolution class in college, a 400 level. I took a physical anthropology, then a human evolution. I would say, first of all, sociology doesn't deal with past societies as much. It deals more with modern societies and deals with institutions. Anthropology deals more holistically with entire societies and tends to focus traditionally on past societies more. Pick up just a basic anthropology book in a bookstore at a college and just read it, and then convince yourself. Don't take my word for it. Just read it. It's there. What I would tell you is it's there. That's how I learned this stuff.
I've been through a lot of these, and
Yeah.
I would disagree with that as being a very persuasive experience.
Reading a book, not persuasive.
On that topic, on what you're saying.
Well, it's as good as the citations and
had
evidence.
people like Margaret Mead and who really fell into disrepute and what she had been proclaiming in her anthropology
Well,
studies.
I don't. She didn't completely fall in disrepute.
No, but she lost her.
but-
She lost an awful lot.
But who is it that pointed that out about Margaret Mead? Other anthropologists, right? They found flaws in how she studied. In fact, she studied these three societies in the Pacific Ocean, and one of the classic mistakes she was accused of was she had observed a society that had just encountered war, and the men who were doing female-linked tasks, were doing it as a temporary existential adaptation to to having been defeated in war. It wasn't what the men normally did. And she didn't catch that. But it was anthropologists who observed that and then brought it out and wrote about it.
Well, I think
that's how science is supposed to work.
I think there are good scientists around who will pick out these flaws.
And they should.
When a notion is expanded from presuppositions.
But look, rather than waste our time,
Could we
why
move on?
don't you just lay it on the table that the Bible is the infallible Word of God, and that's the end of it. And then now we can move on again.
Aren't there
Okay, we can do that.
Yeah, let's do that.
archaeological digs that, and like cave paintings and all kinds of evidence of past groups? And we're not discussing how long in the past, but past groups that we could tell what their beliefs were by that evidence of the things they left, by altars and by paintings of their gods and things like that.
There's a whole field that specializes in this within anthropology. It's called archaeology. Amy, why don't we have an archaeologist, professor who does this for a living, come and speak on that subject? How do you know what happened in Neolithic France? And
I'd argue with him too.
okay.
But here's the important point. We can't argue with you. Because if you accept something on faith, that something is the inherent and infallible Word of God, there's no discussion left. So let's not have the discussion.
But say,
I'd also like to
you
point out
will argue, and I've heard you argue that things, and Phil puts it in a lot of his writings, Phil Pecorino, that things have to be established by evidence.
This must be bothering you enough that you come here. You must have questions of your own.
I'd like to point something out. I'd like to, for those of you who haven't met him before, this is Ken. Ken is a friend of was a friend of Kevin Cordell's, and you may remember Kevin being the evangelist minister who who he calls it deconverted. Ken was kind enough to come to that particular meeting last year, and Ken has different beliefs than we do. I think it's good to have Ken here because when you have an opposing point of view, it forces you to re-examine your own. It forces you to look at your own arguments and see. I don't think it's bad to have Ken here, and I hope that we won't all jump all over him. He doesn't typically
Jerry wouldn't say all that.
Well,
I didn't say don't put words in my mouth. But look, I'm just blunt.
I'm just saying. I'm just saying.
If you're going to give us a faith-based argument, and we're all talking evidence-based.
You're giving a faith-based argument, though. Atheism is a faith-based argument.
No.
I don't agree. I don't even agree with what
But-
you said about presuppositions, but that's the whole other.
But then again, but we can all continue to talk in an atmosphere of mutual respect, and we are, and I just want to remind everyone of that everyone here, at least as far as I know, believes in compassion, respect, responsibility, understanding, and that includes being nice to people when they have different views. It doesn't mean that I think that you're right, but I'm always happy to hear you speak.
All right, everyone put away your knives now, damn it.
Yeah, and
One more question. How are we doing on time? I'm okay. I enjoy answering your questions, but I don't want to go past my time
we
if any of
actually
you are
have
squirming.
about 10 minutes left before we're supposed to wrap up.
Okay, so we'll take one more
So-
question here.
Yes.
Okay.
I would like to ask, Ken, you went into Margaret Mead.
Can we actually leave that and just
We're going to miss...
keep questions for Chris?
I didn't come
And
here
then-
to disrupt.
Yeah.
This is your show.
Well, no, but I think my question...
Hold on. I don't come here to disrupt the show.
No, you
And I'm
don't.
quiet most of the time until maybe the end, and I'll ask my questions.
Yeah.
But I find listening to what you all have to say is like having a sparring partner. And I appreciate having the opposition of people that think differently, just so that I can work out my own beliefs better.
But I
I
wanted
think
to
that's
ask you,
commendable.
do you
But-
realize that when you spoke about Margaret Mead, you were defining science? You were defining the ultimate purpose of science. Science is not static. It's dynamic.
Well, my point,
And a scientist's discovery today will be refuted tomorrow. That's the purpose of science, to find something new.
and that's why science is not a long-living standard for what is true. It's always changing, and always will change.
Well, I like that.
Knowledge.
Okay, but it's not truth.
Because I
If
think
it's
life
changing.
is dynamic.
It's not, if it's changing all the time, then it's no longer truth.
Well, what is, I don't know.
See, he's defining truth as coming down from God. When we understand truth with a little t, he has it with a big T. Truth is to him, with a big T, is like,
Well, you're
comes
putting,
from on down from the
you're putting
sky.
words in his mouth
Us with a
now.
little t, well, I'll see if he refutes it, but to us with truth with a little t means the most accurate depiction of reality that we could come up with at this moment.
Well, I'm not going to press the point. You know what she says. You're putting it in my mouth.
All right, no, but you can
I'll
refute that.
let you- I'll leave it.
Capital T truth, what is that?
I'll leave it with where we are.
And
Let Chris
again, we
ask
have a
more
speaker, and you're supposed to have questions and answers for him right now. So,
So, you know anything? Yeah, one more.
You mentioned Freud, and what I'm familiar with, I reread it recently, Totem and Taboo, and you suggested that some of the new evidence, perhaps, are the views he expressed there, and that he's expressed a lot about patricide, about animism being in powerful figures, whether human or powerful animals. I mean, is there any variance from that now?
I don't know. I don't know. Yeah, I don't study animism per se. I just study just enough to know that link here, and yeah, I'm just presenting to you a broad view of society and these where religions are associated with different society types. It did remind me of something when you mentioned Freud. I thought I would throw out to you all and see if you've ever heard of this book. It's one of my favorite books. There's a new website called ilikewise.com. It's one of these ilikewise.com. It's a dating website that you put your favorite books on there. You list your favorite books, and you can actually type in the author or the book, and it comes up from Amazon, and it actually shows the cover of the book there. So you can click on it, you put a blurb about why you like this book so much, why is it so meaningful to you. So I saw it in the New York Times. So I said, what the heck? So I went on there, and I clicked on my 5 favorite books. One of them was Carl Sagan, Demon Haunted World, and so on. And anyway, it matches you up based on that, based on shared book taste. I just thought that was kind of a cool thing. But it forced me to reflect on what my favorite books are. I had to put it down, because there's so many books that I've read. And I have to say, if I had to name one book of all time as my favorite, it would be Ernest Becker, The Denial of Death. Won a Pulitzer Prize in 1973, and then he had a follow-up to that called Escape from Evil, which is similarly good. But it's about these deep questions on societies and religion and what Freud said. He reworked some of Freud's flaws, and it was a fascinating book that I think any free thinker would like. It wasn't about religion or non-belief per se, but he assumes that you're with him, that he kind of assumes that you're a secular, educated non-believer in some ways, but he works with why we kill, why we go to war. It's a very macro synthesis sort of thing. If any of you have read Jared Diamond, Guns, Germs, and Steel, it's kind of similar work, very similar macro level synthesis.
Did you get any dates out of it?
Oh, no, I just did it. I just went on there a few days ago. Put my 5 books
What
up
is
there.
the textbook that you were mentioning there?
This is a book I use in my class. John Macionis, the latest edition of Sociology, 13th edition, I think. And it's one of the most widely used in the world. It's translated into other languages.
And the author is Macionis?
Yeah, John J. Macionis.
was that around when we were in
Yes.
college?
Yeah, I think when I was in college, it was the second edition
I was
myself.
looking at the name, and I was thinking that's really familiar.
Yeah.
Can you
I find that it's a really good one. It's very good at evidence, and it shows a lot of data, a lot of good maps in it.
We're trying to see it, but you're moving.
Oh, sorry.
We want to write down. We want to see the
spelling of the last name.
Macionis.
Yes.
One C.
Don't expect that book in the book club. Come on.
Detection of Bob. We should
And
retest
by
it
the way,
13th edition.
next month, actually the February 1st, we're book club. We are going to be talking about Sex at Dawn. that particular book,
which
and
does not
I am going
about
to be leading the discussion.
Prehistoric. It talks a lot about
So, hotsy
the
totsy.
prehistoric times.
Yes, oh, I've read it. I've read it twice.
So Amy, you're definitely going to lead that discussion, right?
Yes.
Good.
Good.
Yeah, I got a babysitter and
Demonstrations,
everything.
everything. Right.
Oh, yeah, Chris, I've been meaning to talk to you about that.
Amy had, on my atheist meetup list, we had a fierce discussion of whether you can apply evolutionary theories to a lot of modern behaviors. I happen to be a person, very strong, obvious believer in evolutionary theory, but I don't go along with a lot of the very faddish evolutionary psychology stuff that's dominating Psychology Today magazine and the press. I see an ideological kind of sexism going on there. I don't think you can really apply a lot of evolutionary genetic theories to human social behaviors. It's more complex than that. So that could be a really good discussion.
Well, maybe you should come.
Yeah, I'll definitely be here for
Come
that.
to our book club.
Yeah, come to our book club. So thank you
for
very
having
much.
me.